Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin with a question that should stop us in our tracks. What happens when we confuse illusion with reality? For too long, Western leaders have sold us illusions. Illusions about Ukraine as a beacon of democracy, illusions about starving Russia's war machine with sanctions, and illusions about victory through slogans rather than strategy. The truth is far less comfortable, but it must be faced with courage. Illusions cannot win wars. That is a statement we should engrave in our minds, because history is littered with nations and empires that fell into ruin by clinging to myths instead of accepting reality. When leaders and citizens alike prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths, strategy collapses, soldiers pay the price, and nations weaken themselves from within. Look around today. We are told daily that Ukraine is on the path to victory, that sanctions are crippling Russia, that one more round of funding, one more shipment of weapons, one more stirring speech will change the tide, yet the facts on the ground do not align with these promises. The illusion of success has become the strategy itself, and that is a dangerous place for any nation to be. Ask yourself this: how many times in history have leaders insisted that their enemies were weak, collapsing on the verge of defeat, only for reality to prove otherwise? Napoleon marched into Russia convinced he would break an empire within weeks. Hitler made the same mistake a century later. Both were seduced by illusions of quick victory, illusions that blinded them to the resilience, the geography, and the industrial might of their adversaries. Today, the West risks making the same mistake by imagining that Russia is brittle, that it can be starved into surrender, that political slogans can substitute for strategic depth. The illusion comforts us, but it also paralyzes us, preventing the sober reassessment that real leadership demands. Illusions are powerful because they offer hope without cost. They whisper that sacrifice will be temporary, that victory is inevitable, that the other side is already beaten. Who doesn't want to believe that? But illusions are also deadly because they create complacency in our decision makers. When leaders surround themselves with advisors who echo the same myths, when media repeats them daily as if repetition creates truth, the illusion becomes a cage. And when the battlefield exposes the truth, as it always does, nations discover too late that they have wasted time, treasure, and trust on falsehoods. That is the tragedy of illusion in war. It hides reality until the cost of ignoring it is unbearable. We see this play out today in the rhetoric surrounding Ukraine. The illusion says that Ukraine is fighting a war of liberation with the West firmly at its back. The illusion says that Russia's war machine is fragile, its economy crumbling, its people desperate. The illusion says that Ukraine is a partner in democracy and not a state riddled with corruption, organized crime, and power struggles. But what is the truth? The truth is that Russia's defense industry is surging, producing weapons and ammunition at a pace the West cannot match. The truth is that sanctions have not collapsed Moscow's economy. Instead, Russia has shifted trade toward Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, securing energy markets and building partnerships that outlast Western headlines. The truth is that Ukraine is not becoming stronger. It is bleeding manpower, losing infrastructure, and increasingly dependent on foreign aid that disappears into shadow networks as fast as it arrives. Here is the hook, and it should trouble every thinking citizen. Illusions do not simply fail, they fail spectacularly. They fail at the worst possible time, when the enemy has grown stronger and your own position has grown weaker. Illusions lull nations into wasting their strength on strategies that cannot succeed, leaving them exposed when reality finally breaks through. That is why illusions cannot win wars, because wars are decided not by speeches, not by wishful thinking, but by facts on the ground: men, machines, resources, geography, and time. And none of these facts bend themselves to comforting stories told in parliaments, congresses, or television studios. If we continue to cling to illusions, we risk not only losing in Ukraine, but weakening the very foundation of our own nations. Wars are not won by pretending the enemy is collapsing. They are won by preparing for what the enemy can actually do. That requires clarity, discipline, and honesty, qualities that illusions smother. Leaders who ignore reality in favor of fantasy are not only deceiving their citizens, they are steering their nations into disaster. The battlefield does not reward illusions, it punishes them. And unless we recognize that now, the punishment awaiting us will be far harsher than most imagine. Ukraine is not a democracy but an organized crime state, and acknowledging this fact is not cynicism. It is the first step toward understanding why so much of the West's effort in this conflict has been wasted. We have been told again and again that Ukraine stands as a shining example of freedom, a fortress of democracy on Europe's frontier. Yet the moment you look beyond the slogans, you discover something far less inspiring: a political system riddled with corruption, a society dominated by oligarchs, and a wartime economy that rewards those who profit from smuggling, extortion, and graft. The hook is simple and painful. You cannot build a legitimate strategy for victory on a foundation of lies about your partner's integrity. When billions of dollars in aid are sent to Ukraine, where do they actually go? The story told in Washington, London, and Brussels is that this money equips soldiers, strengthens defenses, and sustains the fight for freedom. But the reality, admitted even in quiet reports from auditors and inspectors, is that large portions of this aid vanish into networks of organized crime. Weapons are diverted to black markets, food and fuel are resold at inflated prices, and officials grow rich while ordinary citizens endure misery. This is not the exception, it is the pattern. Ukraine's history since independence is a chronicle of oligarchs carving up industries, of politicians treating the state as a private business, of law enforcement acting as the hired muscle of whoever pays most. To pretend that war has erased these structures is to fall for another illusion, one even more dangerous than the first. If Ukraine were truly the democracy it is painted to be, its citizens would have a voice in the direction of this war. Yet dissent is silenced, opposition parties have been banned, media outlets shuttered, and independent voices exiled or imprisoned. What does it say when the beacon of democracy functions under wartime authoritarianism, justified by the convenient label of national security? In practice, this looks less like a democracy and far more like a state managed by those who wield power ruthlessly, rewarding their allies while suppressing anyone who questions their authority. And it is precisely in such environments that organized crime thrives, because the difference between politics and criminal enterprise becomes almost impossible to distinguish. Western leaders may argue that the corruption of Ukraine is a side issue, something that can be cleaned up after the war is won. But this argument fails for one simple reason: corruption is not peripheral to the conflict, it is central to it. When money intended for soldiers never reaches them, when weapons vanish from stockpiles, when reconstruction funds are siphoned into the pockets of the powerful, the effectiveness of Ukraine's war effort collapses. This corruption does not just weaken Ukraine internally, it directly undermines the sacrifices made by Western taxpayers and the credibility of Western governments. It sends a message to ordinary citizens: your sacrifices are not building security, they are feeding criminals. And once that perception hardens, trust is destroyed not only in Ukraine but in the leaders who insisted this was a noble cause. Another hook emerges when we ask a basic question: who really benefits from the endless flow of money and arms into Ukraine? Is it the Ukrainian people? Is it the Western nations that provide it? Or is it the small circle of power brokers, oligarchs, and crime networks who thrive in chaos? The uncomfortable answer is that war has become an industry, and Ukraine has become the market. Every dollar sent without accountability strengthens the very forces that prevent genuine reform. Every weapon lost to black markets strengthens transnational criminal organizations. Every promise that Ukraine is a democratic partner strengthens the illusion that perpetuates the waste. To see Ukraine clearly is not to abandon it, but to stop pretending it is something it is not. If we continue to sell the image of a democracy while feeding the reality of an organized crime state, we are complicit in the deception. More importantly, we are complicit in the failure that follows. Wars are not won by criminals enriching themselves, they are lost by soldiers who go underfed, underarmed, and unsupported while others steal in their name. The West cannot afford to ignore this, because illusions about Ukraine's character do not just distort strategy, they guarantee defeat. You cannot starve the Russian war machine, and that statement should ring like a warning bell to every policymaker who still clings to the illusion that sanctions alone can determine the outcome of this conflict. From the very beginning, Western leaders promised that financial pressure, trade restrictions, and diplomatic isolation would cripple Moscow's ability to wage war. They insisted that Russia's economy would collapse, that its industries would grind to a halt, that its people would turn against the Kremlin. Yet none of this has materialized. Instead, Russia has adapted, adjusted, and even expanded its capacity to produce the weapons and ammunition it needs. The hook is obvious. While the West fights an economic war with press releases and headlines, Russia fights a real war with factories running day and night. The lesson we should have learned from history is that industrial powers under pressure rarely collapse, they reorient. During the Second World War, Allied bombing campaigns were designed to destroy German industry, yet Germany managed to increase production even under devastating attacks. Japan, blockaded and bombed, still found ways to sustain its war machine for years. Today, Russia faces nothing close to that level of destruction. Its resources remain vast, its factories intact, and its global trade routes open to partners willing to ignore Western demands. China, India, Turkey, Iran, and much of the global South have no interest in crippling their own economies simply to appease Washington or Brussels. Energy, grain, metals, and military technology continue to flow. Sanctions have inconvenienced Moscow, but they have not strangled it. The reality is undeniable. Russia is producing more artillery shells than NATO, more tanks than Ukraine can destroy, and more missiles than sanctions were ever supposed to allow. Wars are not won in financial markets. They are won in factories, fields, and foundries. Russia controls its own vast natural resources, from oil and gas to minerals critical for weapons production. Unlike Western nations that rely heavily on fragile global supply chains, Russia can fuel its own industries. This self-sufficiency, combined with determination, makes the idea of starving Russia not only naive but strategically foolish. The very policies designed to weaken Moscow have instead accelerated its partnerships with Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, creating alternative markets that bypass the West entirely. Instead of isolating Russia, sanctions have isolated the West from the majority of the world that refuses to play by its rules. It is important to recognize another uncomfortable truth. Russia's economy is not structured like those of Western democracies. In the West, political survival depends on consumer satisfaction, on short-term growth, on maintaining lifestyles. In Russia, the state can mobilize resources directly for war, prioritize military production, and demand sacrifices from its population in ways that Western leaders cannot. Sanctions may make life harder for ordinary Russians, but they have not broken the government's control or its war effort. In fact, hardship has often strengthened internal resolve, uniting the population around the perception that the West seeks to destroy them. Far from turning the people against the Kremlin, sanctions have reinforced the idea that Russia is under siege and must fight on. The West assumed that financial weapons could replace real strategy. Instead of asking how to end the war through diplomacy, restraint, or balance of power, leaders gambled everything on the belief that economic punishment could accomplish what military action could not. But economies do not surrender, factories do not give up, and nations with a sense of purpose do not collapse simply because outsiders want them to. You cannot bankrupt determination. You cannot sanction away industrial strength. You cannot starve a war machine that has secured its own supply lines and built new ones across continents. This leads us to the most critical hook of all. Every day the West clings to the fantasy of starving Russia. It loses time, resources, and credibility. Every new round of sanctions that fails to deliver collapse exposes the emptiness of the strategy. Every speech promising victory through economic pressure alone deepens the gap between illusion and reality. Meanwhile, Russia is not waiting, it is building, producing, and preparing for the long war, and wars, as history proves, are won by those who can outproduce, outlast, and outfight their opponents. By that measure, sanctions are not a weapon of victory, they are a shield of denial. The West is draining its own strength, and this reality is perhaps the most dangerous consequence of the current war strategy. Instead of weakening Russia, the policies of endless aid, open-ended commitments, and reckless rhetoric are bleeding the resources, arsenals, and morale of Western nations themselves. The hook is clear and piercing. While leaders proclaim that they are standing with Ukraine, what they are truly doing is eroding the very foundations of their own security, trading long-term stability for the illusion of short-term influence. Look first at the military cost. The United States and its European allies have poured tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons, ammunition, and advanced systems into Ukraine. Yet the battlefield results have not matched the investment. Weapons disappear faster than they can be replaced, and stockpiles that took decades to build have been drained in a matter of months. European nations now face empty arsenals, their own readiness degraded to dangerous levels. The United States, stretched thin with global commitments, finds itself forced to consider rationing munitions, delaying maintenance, and cutting corners in training just to keep pace. This is not strategy, this is self-sabotage. A military cannot remain credible if it expends its core strength on a proxy war it cannot control. The hook here is undeniable. The more the West gives to Ukraine, the weaker it becomes in facing its own direct challenges. The economic burden follows closely behind. Western taxpayers are told their sacrifices are noble, that their money ensures freedom and stability. But what do they see? Rising inflation, spiraling debt, energy shortages, and budgets stretched thin by commitments that seem to have no end. Infrastructure at home crumbles while billions flow abroad. Healthcare, education, and domestic security are neglected in favor of writing blank checks for a war effort with no clear objective. The illusion is that this is sustainable, but the truth is harsher. No nation can endlessly fund another's survival without paying the price in its own decline. The public feels this in their daily lives, and with every new round of aid, trust in leadership erodes further. There is also the strategic exhaustion that comes from chasing illusions. Western governments have tied their reputations to the idea that Ukraine must win, that Russia must be defeated, that failure is unthinkable. But the longer this war drags on, the more obvious it becomes that these promises cannot be fulfilled. Leaders, instead of reassessing, double down, committing more resources, more weapons, more political capital. In doing so, they weaken their own flexibility, their ability to pivot to new realities, their capacity to deal with other looming crises. China, the Middle East, economic instability, these challenges do not pause while the West drains itself in Ukraine. The hook here is brutal. A strategy that consumes strength without achieving results is not leadership, it is surrender to delusion. Consider the psychological cost as well. Soldiers, citizens, and allies alike begin to sense when the rhetoric no longer matches the results. They see the gap between promises of victory and the reports of stalemate, corruption, and failure. Confidence in institutions begins to erode. Allies question commitments. Rivals grow bolder, sensing weakness. The West's greatest strength has always been its credibility, the trust that when it speaks, it acts with resolve and purpose. But draining strength on a war that cannot be won under current terms chips away at that credibility piece by piece. Once lost, it is not easily regained. The irony is sharp. In attempting to weaken Russia through a war of attrition, the West has instead set itself on a path of attrition. The industrial capacity of Russia is surging, while Western factories struggle to meet even peacetime demands. The financial reserves of Russia are adapting, while Western nations pile debt upon debt. The will of the Russian people has hardened, while Western citizens grow weary of endless sacrifice for unclear goals. The illusion of draining Russia has become the reality of draining the West, and the longer this continues, the more the balance shifts in Moscow's favor. Strength is not measured by how much you give away, but by how much you retain to defend your own interests. By bleeding their treasuries and arsenals for Ukraine, Western leaders are not proving resolve, they are exposing vulnerability. The essence of strategy is to preserve your own power while using it effectively. Yet here, the opposite has occurred. Power is wasted, illusions are fed, and strength is eroded. A nation that cannot protect its own foundation cannot hope to shape the future. The West is draining its own strength, and unless it stops, it will discover too late that its greatest adversary is not abroad, but within its own failing strategy. The real winners are oligarchs and arms dealers, and that is the bitter truth few are willing to admit openly. Whenever a conflict drags on without clear objectives, without honest accounting, and without a defined end state, the beneficiaries are not the ordinary people who suffer, nor the nations that sacrifice, but those who profit from the machinery of war. Ukraine has become the stage for this pattern, a war where rivers of money and weapons flow, and those who know how to exploit chaos grow richer by the day. The hook here is sharp. When war becomes an industry, peace becomes the enemy of profit. Look at Ukraine itself. From the very beginning, its political system has been dominated by oligarchs, figures who control industries, media, and vast sums of wealth. These men have always thrived on instability, using crisis as a tool to entrench their influence. In wartime, their power only grows. Reconstruction funds are funneled through their companies, foreign aid disappears into their networks, and contracts for weapons, fuel, and food are handed to their allies. The ordinary soldier at the front sees little of this aid. Instead, he receives scraps while the well-connected siphon off the bulk. This is not accidental, it is systemic. The war provides the perfect cover for corruption, where accountability is dismissed as unpatriotic and anyone who questions the flow of money is branded a traitor. But the oligarchs in Ukraine are only one side of the story. On the other side, Western defense contractors and arms manufacturers are enjoying profits not seen in decades. Every missile fired, every tank destroyed, every artillery shell expended is not just a loss on the battlefield, it is an order for replacement, a contract signed, a stock price climbing. For these corporations, war is not tragedy, it is opportunity. Their factories run day and night, not for national defense, but for endless resupply to a proxy conflict. The hook here is undeniable. As long as the war continues, their profits soar, and peace would mean the closing of those contracts. This arrangement creates a vicious cycle. Oligarchs in Ukraine profit by ensuring that aid and resources are absorbed into their networks. Arms dealers in the West profit by ensuring the war never ends, because an end to the fighting would also end the flow of contracts. Politicians, meanwhile, align themselves with these interests, rewarded with campaign donations, lobbying support, and political protection. The people, both in Ukraine and in the West, become the silent losers in this arrangement, paying with their lives, their tax dollars, and their security while others enrich themselves. The illusion sold to the public is one of noble sacrifice, but the reality is a transfer of wealth from ordinary citizens to the war profiteers. Consider the hook that cuts the deepest. When war becomes profitable, the incentive to end it disappears. Every day of fighting, every shipment of arms, every new appropriation of funds is another payday for someone who has no stake in peace. In such a system, negotiations are discouraged. Diplomacy is undermined, and any voice calling for restraint is silenced. Peace is not seen as victory, but as a loss of revenue. That is why conflicts like this drag on far longer than they should, not because they cannot be resolved, but because too many powerful actors benefit from their continuation. The human cost is hidden behind this machinery of profit. Families in Ukraine are torn apart, lives shattered, infrastructure destroyed, yet the oligarchs grow richer. Citizens in the West face rising costs, dwindling resources, and declining trust in leadership, yet defense corporations post record earnings. The disparity is obscene, and yet it persists because illusions are carefully maintained. Leaders speak of defending freedom, standing for democracy, and confronting tyranny, while in reality they are ensuring the balance sheets of arms manufacturers remain strong and the power of oligarchs remains unchallenged. When the real winners are oligarchs and arms dealers, the real losers are everyone else. The soldiers who die on the battlefield are not fighting for victory, they are dying for profit margins. The citizens who pay their taxes are not funding security, they are funding corruption. And the nations that exhaust themselves in this effort are not defending values, they are subsidizing a marketplace of war. Until this truth is acknowledged, the cycle will not break, and the profits of a few will continue to outweigh the suffering of millions. True leadership demands courage to face reality, and this is the quality most absent in the West's handling of the war in Ukraine. It is far easier for politicians to cling to illusions, to repeat comforting slogans, and to disguise failure with noble words than it is to admit the truth. The strategy is broken, the costs are rising, and the war cannot be won in its current form. The hook is simple yet powerful. Leadership is not about telling people what they want to hear, it is about telling them what they need to know, no matter how uncomfortable. History is full of leaders who refused to face reality and paid the price. In Vietnam, American politicians insisted for years that victory was around the corner, that the enemy was on the brink of collapse, that just a little more effort would bring success. Meanwhile, the reality on the ground told a different story, one of stalemate, waste, and eventual defeat. In Afghanistan, the same pattern played out for 2 decades. Generals and presidents promised progress while corruption and insurgency grew stronger. When the final collapse came, it was sudden only to those who refused to see the truth all along. Ukraine now risks becoming the latest chapter in this long book of denial. Leaders without courage repeat illusions until reality crushes them. Facing reality requires honesty, and honesty requires sacrifice, not from soldiers on the battlefield, but from leaders in office. It requires admitting mistakes, reevaluating strategies, and sometimes reversing course. Yet this is precisely what most leaders fear, because admitting failure risks their political survival. The hook is brutal. Cowardice in leadership always disguises itself as resolve. They pretend that continuing a failed policy is strength, when in fact it is weakness. Real strength is the ability to stop, to think, to change, and to chart a new course even in the face of criticism. True leadership also means protecting your people before protecting your pride. Right now, Western citizens are being asked to shoulder endless burdens, higher taxes, depleted resources, and reduced security, while leaders refuse to acknowledge that their strategy is draining the West more than it is draining Russia. Courage would mean standing before the people and saying, "This is not working. We must reassess." Cowardice is standing before them and declaring, "Victory is near if only you give me more." One path leads to trust and resilience, the other to betrayal and collapse. Wars are not lost by soldiers, they are lost by leaders who cannot face reality. The men in trenches, the citizens at home, the allies abroad, they all depend on leadership that can see clearly and act decisively. When leaders instead choose illusion, they betray the very people they claim to serve. Every wasted dollar, every empty arsenal, every broken promise traces back not to the enemy, but to the failure of leadership. It is not the courage of soldiers that is in question, it is the courage of statesmen. Courageous leadership also demands foresight. It means asking not only how to fight today, but how to build peace tomorrow. What is the end state? What comes after the war? These are questions that illusions avoid because illusions live only in the present, feeding hope while hiding the future. But leadership that faces reality forces these questions onto the table. If Ukraine cannot win outright, what negotiations are possible? If Russia cannot be starved, how can balance be restored? If the West cannot endlessly give, how can strength be preserved? These are the questions that require courage to ask and greater courage to answer. True leadership demands accountability. Leaders who gamble with illusions should be held responsible when those illusions collapse. Yet too often, they escape blame, passing the cost onto the public while preserving their own careers. The hook that must be remembered is this: leadership without accountability is not leadership at all. It is deception. Real leaders accept the consequences of their choices and stand by the results, whether success or failure. Only then can trust be rebuilt, and only then can strategy be aligned with reality.